My conversation today is with Phoenix Aurelius, alchemist, researcher, educator, and modern-day Renaissance man. Truly. He heads the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, an educational research center and apothecary dedicated to providing cutting-edge investigative methods into the practice of alchemy. One of Phoenix's missions is to introduce spagyria, a remedial application of alchemical processes, into the fabric of mainstream society as a form of healing that has the potential to positively impact lifestyles, bioculture, and overall well-being to an exceedingly significant degree. We sat down to talk about several topics, including alchemy, spagyria, and their effects on consciousness, not only through ingestion, but also and especially as praxis. We also touched on tropical versus sidereal astrological influences on agriculture and the incredible calendar which the Academy has released for 2023, collating years of research in the field, the astronomological calendar. Phoenix's depth of knowledge and ability to synthesize, articulate, and contextualize so many different aspects of the traditions left me humbled and inspired, and I'm very pleased to share our conversation with you all. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanum Podcast. So I'm very interested in a lot of the stuff that you do. I am, I guess, kind of an amateur herbalist myself. I'm somebody I've been studying this stuff for longer than I even thought I had. I've been telling people since 2009, but I found these notebooks like 3 or 4 days ago they were dated from 2004, and they had a bunch of Kabbalah in it and stuff. So I'm like, wow, it's been that long. But the thing is, I'm relatively new to. I haven't given practical alchemy a shot, and part of the reason is that I already have many expensive hobbies, and and the other reason is that it was inculcated to me by one of my first, I guess you would call it, teachers in the Western esoteric tradition, to primarily focus more on spiritual alchemy, because of the nature of what I was doing. And so for a while I was kind of scratching my head at practical, like lab alchemists. And now it's like, man, I've been missing out on something really cool for a really long time.
Yeah, well, I guess it just depends on where you come from. I'm actually reading a book right now that kind of touches a lot on spiritual practices of alchemists from the 19th century occult revival until the present. And that's what you hear most of the people saying. Even Israel Regardie, before he went to study alchemy with Frater Albertus, was very much so of that opinion, and what's funny is that inside of those circles, I rarely see somebody that practices practical alchemy. And so all these guys are saying, oh, you should really just focus on the spiritual alchemy. And I just think that gets perpetuated because people don't know where to begin with the lab alchemy. And they would lead somebody down the wrong road or pretentiously be doing something that they wouldn't. But right. Yeah, the alchemical practices, spiritual alchemical practices, I mean to say, of most of Western esoteric mysticism is pretty intact, though. It's really good work. And you find that the people who do it increase their discipline massively and are able to accomplish a great deal more than what they were ever able to accomplish before. So it's a viable path all of its own, I think. But it becomes a lot more integrated in my experience, having a spiritual alchemy background, and then and then also practicing spagyrics without even knowing that that's what I was doing. That spagyria had anything to do with alchemy for like the first 2 years I was practicing. And then later kind of putting all of that into a laboratory practice. I think it's the most potent and impactful system of initiation of Western mysteries that I've ever experienced. And, I do experience a lot and I read a lot. So yeah, maybe that means something.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually my first real introduction to taking it seriously and I don't mean to say that I began practicing it, but I started taking it seriously, was in actually, I think the Philosopher's Stone. It was either the or it might have been in the actual text, but Regarty mentioning that I did not believe a jot of the laboratory alchemy until I saw Frater Albertus.
Yeah,
do I think he either made the stone or he did the transmutation to gold. I think it was a transmutation to gold, and really won him over. And then shortly after that, as synchronicity would have it, I read something by Mark Stavish on his forays in practical lab alchemy, and the way that he explained it really made sense to me, in that you're kind of creating this microcosm relative to your macrocosm, and putting this plant material through and going through that journey with it, and but putting it through an alchemical process that you would like to have happen to you as well, and having that be reflected in the entire process, and then taking that into your physical organism as a spagyric. And I really appreciated the spiritual practice that accompanied all that stuff. There was a lot of prayer, there was a lot of meditation, and that kind of stuff. And it's definitely something that I'm very interested in. And I think it's something worth talking about, because I know a lot of people who just do spiritual alchemy. And I think I really do think that there is there's an audience for it that is just not, they don't know, like you said, I think you put it perfectly, they don't know where to begin. So where would you suggest someone begins?
That's a pretty good question. Amorc had a system in the early 20th century, we're talking like the 1930s, where they would teach the first couple of degrees of initiation, but then they would also have classes available to teach people basic spagyrics and so on and so forth. And realistically, from about the time of the scientific revolution onwards, it's the Rosicrucian tradition that really encapsulated and preserved alchemy to the best of its ability. And so they took a lot of liberty with various spiritual practices and called them historical. That happened a lot just during the 19th century in general, with history and not even just metaphysics, but metaphysics ideas became very syncretic. People were drawing from all sorts of different types of sorts of inspiration, kind of creating something that worked for the time, but they would say, oh, this is very, very ancient, right? Like this comes directly from Egypt. And it's like, well, threads of it definitely do. The practices themselves, maybe not 100% historically accurate. It doesn't stand up to scholasticism all the time. Alchemy is no different than that. In fact, from the time of Paracelsus onwards, we have this sulfur mercury salt theory that pervades all of modern Western day spiritual alchemy. But we actually begin to see it in the laboratory with various materials. And so when we're taking a look at the practices of lab alchemy as they exist today, the easiest ways to get into them, especially for people coming from a spiritual alchemy background, are the very first practices that Amorc put out in their spagyric work. And it has been suggested and taught by Frater Albertus, who was essentially born out of that Amorc tradition, or his lab practice and stuff. Like, for instance, he studied himself at San Jose Rosicrucian Park, and then once they stopped offering alchemy classes there, then he ended up publishing through the Rosicrucian Journal various advertisements to get his students. And what that work typically looks like today are what are called spagyric tinctures. And the first step is to take 7 of them. Each one of them is made for one day of the week and corresponds to the planetary correspondence of those days of the week in the Western mystery tradition. So Saturn for Saturday, Sun for Sunday, Mun for moon days, so on and so forth. But the reason that we do that is you make 7 different spagyric tinctures that have a good amount of fixed sulfur. Fixed sulfur would be our fixed ego, basically, and the aspects of us that we can't necessarily change that contribute to how other people perceive us and how we perceive and identify ourselves. So like our clothing choices, the color of our hair, the shortness of our hair, the style that which we come across, the sound of our voice, right? Some of these things, they're fixed into our persona, they're fixed, and they accompany the body of the material. In the same way that we can use pure spirit or alcohol to be able to extract that essence from the body. It comes from the body of the herb that we're extracting. And so what we end up seeing is that spirit is our discipline, it's our awareness, it's our ability to get in the lab and to crush that herb down over and over and over to a point where it's actually really fine, which operating mortar and pestle just for the first few times in initiatic practice, I mean, you're sore and like crazy. I mean, your hand hurts, but you just have to grind those things. And you learn how to put time and effort into something that you ultimately use as a tool to develop quantum observation. Like it's like you recognize that that plant actually is a quality of your psyche, because the whole concept, since about the time of Pythagoras in Western metaphysics, is really that you are everything externally, and that you are the master of that, being part of humanity. We are the most volatile of all of the beings, and we are made up of all of the different elements of metals, of minerals, of vegetables, of animal components, and we take and absorb all these things in. So when we're working with these members of the plant kingdom, we are actually working with a part of ourselves that we have already evolved through in order to be this pinnacle of humankind. And you're reawakening it, and you're putting it through a process, a sequential process of transformation, or even of exaltation. Doesn't always have to be towards the, ad perpetuante transformatione, as we'd call it, to the purpose of transformation. It really just needs to be consistent progress towards the exaltation and the pristine structure of that thing. And in making a spagyric tincture, you go through initiation after initiation after initiation with each different phase. And the further that you refine your substances and the more attention that you put on it, the more you get out of it. So that's why I always tell my students, the slower you go, the faster you get where you're going. But then it provides you with a physical substance that you yourself have made and crafted with this material, where you have through this quantum state of observation, identified it to be yourself or an aspect of yourself. And then you can take that perfected medicine to be able to volatilize, so to speak, the energy channels in the physical body to be able to operate within the framework of that planetary sphere's kind of archetypal energy within you. And so, when we talk about path working in Western spiritual esoteric work and navigating our way through this Chaim, or through the tree of life, the way that we do that in alchemy is by working through the plants and through different items of pharmacopoeia, and then into the animal realm and the mineral realm, and then finally into the metallic realm. And the amorphic system basically has this way of creating items of pharmacopoeia and goals, so to speak, inside of your lab work that constantly keep you moving. And I personally don't think anybody was better at creating a system in this regard as Jean Dubuis was. And his systems, the philosophers of nature, are the very best. So yeah, I think that it would be good to look into the old AMOR curriculums if you could find them. If not, in my personal opinion, I think the Jean Dubuis material of the philosophers of nature is kind of where it's at, the best place to start for most people.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Thank you. Actually, I think the philosophers of nature stuff it's online for free, at least a significant amount of it. I've looked into that stuff. So just in case anybody's listening, I'm pretty sure you can just go and download it. I'll include a link in the show notes. So you mentioned something about you mentioned that it's typically through spagyric alchemy. So spagyric alchemy, working with plants. A lot of people think alchemy, and right out of the gate they think metals, which is, like you were saying, uh, kind of an attenuation of it. I think that kind of comes back to that whole idea of how frequently it's used as a spiritual analogy, and so
Yeah.
I guess they just borrowed the mineral aspect to kind of signify that kind of thing. But I know that you run a research academy based on all this stuff, and one of the goals is to integrate spagyric alchemy into our society. Why do you think spagyrics would be the best candidate within the alchemical sort of milieu for that?
Well, two things. One, what the Amorc tradition refined and relinquished spagyria into was not the full, complete medical system that it actually is. Like Paracelsus wrote it as an entire system of medicine with its own systems of diagnoses, its own causations of disease, its cures. And by no means did any of the cures or the items of pharmacopoeia were they, first of all, restricted to alchemical lab work. There was a lot of energetic healing and psychic healing and other different types of things inside of that pharmacopoeia that even very progressive woo-woo individuals today would be like, wow, this was way advanced. Like, this is stuff people still aren't even touching upon or scraping upon in the modern day. So that's one thing. The definition of spagyria changed, and that was created largely because of this 19th century spiritual alchemist thing. And then when actual alchemists got on stage, they had a hard enough time even describing, like, what is the difference between, this work and these people's works. And again, the Amorc path work is highly syncretic, meaning that it doesn't stick with one alchemical author and just show all of the items that alchemical author talked about and then reproduce them, like just Basil Valentine, for instance, or just Homer, Anton Kirchweger, for instance, from the Golden Chain of Homer. They drew from everything and kind of created a unique synthesis of different items of pharmacopoeia and coursework over time, which in its own right is brilliant. But that's what they ended up calling spagyria, was the herbal works that you take on first. Whereas spagyria, actually, the way that I'm showing it and the way that Paracelsus talked about it himself, actually, there is no barrier to just sticking with the herbal realm. So I guess that's one of the first things I wanted to clarify for listeners, is that when you hear the term spagyric, even amongst most of the greats like Albertus, Jean Dubuis, Manfred Junius, anybody who was born kind of out of that 19th century occult revival alchemical slant, they will call spagyria and relinquish it plant alchemy, but it really isn't. That being said, the first works that they call spagyric in those texts are really critical and foundational, because they start off at a level where you don't need to have a lot of specialized equipment or a lot of expertise in order to get into it. And so you can use simple stuff that you probably already have around. Instead of going and buying a crucible and crucible tongs, you can use just a couple of like meat barbecue tongs and a stainless steel condiment container. Instead of using highly expensive flasks, you can now use mason jars, right? Like you can go and buy alcohol at 95% pure in many different states, and you don't need to be able to distill it yourself. So you don't need to go and buy a distillation setup and start off really big all at once. You can start off at kind of this very simple, approachable way that allows you to be able to make your 7 dailies with stuff that you probably already have around in your kitchen, in order to demonstrate the principles of these things and to be able to see what it is, even at those early phases, with an easy application of those principles, the quality and the virtues of the medicines that you make. And when you take those 7 dailies, the idea is that you make enough for an entire year of you taking them. And you only need like 3 to 5 drops a day, pardon me. And so, you're taking your Saturn plants that correspond to that would be like comfrey, horsetail, chuchuasi, like there's all sorts of different types of herbs that correspond to Saturn, but you would choose one, you would make a spagyric tincture of it, and then you would take 3 drops of that when it's finished every Saturday for an entire year. And you do that with each of your other planetary dailies. And that refines the physiological, the etheric, and the astral components of your being for an entire year with that planetary influence, so that you can begin to perceive more, so that you can move the traumas out of the way, so that you have more etheric energy and psychic capacity to work with in the first place. And and again, you have the entire initiatic process of being able to make it. And the thing that Jean Dubuis noted about alchemy that I really love, laboratory alchemy, is that it's like no other system of initiation that we know of, because it's a complete system of self-initiation. You can't fool yourself if you actually didn't make the thing properly, or it didn't achieve the result that you were hoping for it to achieve. You can't go to the next level. You may have done a lot of work, but you're not initiated into the next level. You didn't earn it. You can't deceive yourself about it, because the project didn't work. Only when it works can you move to the next level, type of thing. And I think that that's kind of really beautiful about it, and tells you when you're ready to move on. A lot of practitioners don't do that, and they try and get as fast through the herbs as possible and go into the metals. And I've seen more people lose their minds do that, because the herbs are volatile and they're safe. They have strong effect for a short period of time. So you have to keep taking them in order to keep up that effect. The more fixed the material is, let's talk about a mineral like potassium carbonate or potassium acetate or whatever. Now that's a mineral. It's not necessarily a metal, because it's acted upon by an outside agent that has catalyzed it to behave in a different way. It has its metal form in there, potassium. But if we go straight to metallic potassium, we're working literally with such a pure consciousness. There's only one element in that potassium ion, and that is potassium. And so it is so pure, whereas an animal material is made of dozens and dozens and dozens of different metals and minerals, which minerals are broken down, less fixed forms. And then plants, same thing, dozens of minerals and acids and reactive gases and all these things. And humans, we're composed of the very most of all of those things. And so, when you work with metals, you're working with the very core elemental substances that minerals and eventually plants and eventually animals and then eventually humans come from. And it's such core identity aspects that you really run the risk of losing your mind if you get into the work and try and progress it too fast. There's a reason why Amorc set those processes out. And it's not just to keep learners, going slowly. It's because if you follow this, it will actually lead you through a system that opens up the energy channels in the appropriate way and in the appropriate time. So,
yeah, I think something that gets lost a lot in the Western esoteric traditions, even in like we say, spiritual trajectories of initiation, is the idea of etheric energy. We dance around it quite a bit. It's much more fleshed out in Eastern systems, in my experience, having being trained in Chinese medicine and qigong and all that stuff. I spent many years doing that, and then bringing it over to magical systems, Western esoteric initiatic magical systems. You are working with etheric energy no matter what you do in life. But the thing is, there's not the same awareness. And I like that you bring that up, that there is this etheric component. I mean, ultimately that's part of the work, right? Is really working with that. I would assume.
Yeah. Well, it depends. Like by the time the Rosicrucians in the early 20th century, which are definitely the traditions of Jean Dubuis and Frater Albertus, and kind of the tradition that even my own work was born from, I've started to go back and revert back to a more historically intact form, specifically focusing on spagyria in my own personal lab work, in my own professional especially. But the system that I was born out of they get you to do practices that essentially achieve the same result as if you were to be performing Neigong or Qigong. Because when you were watching a distillation, first of all, there actually is the ceremonial movement of all of the pieces. You move slow because the glass is thin and also because the substances are precious. And so if you move around quickly, you risk spilling them, breaking them, shattering the container. You can't do that. And it's the very same concept within the movements of Qigong and how you draw energy, how you breathe. All of these things are critically important. And in proper laboratory alchemy, you will end up doing the same thing, moving very slowly, deliberately setting the thing up. And this is kind of the yang aspect of the practice, if we were to borrow terms from TCM or of the Taoist tradition. The yin aspect of the practice comes in once you actually get the system set up, turned on. Now you're using attention and paying attention to the material in the flask. And so under the flask is an actual heating element, which is heating it, but we're using our internal attention and awareness as well in order to be able to see and observe what's going on and use that flask and its boiling material as the visual data to tell us how we are transforming in our spirit, because the part that is distilling is the spirit, water, alcohol, these are the spirits, the mercury. And so we're beginning to gently heat these up and watching as the volition of the spirit is able to rise and eventually descend and be purified through this process of rising, as the Emerald Tablet tells us, from earth to heaven and descends again back to earth, thereby containing within itself the powers of both the above and the below, right? And it's that thing. And so the alchemist not only is using the attention as a heat source, but also using breath as a source of space of awareness. And as you inhale, you can feel as the substance in your boiling flask is volatilizing. And as you exhale, you can feel that it comes down the beak of the retort or starts to condense and flow down the alembic head. And everything that you do, as you're watching those little drops fall from the end of your retort and into a flask, the space between each drop becomes an infinity of potential thought and of depth of thought that you don't usually get with normal waking consciousness. And so for me, that entire process is so similar to the processes of Qigong, just in a different way. And of course, even the Taoists themselves say, we developed the spiritual practices, but the old masters actually used to practice alchemy, and they were actually working with things. They were refining cinnabar, and they were, making nitric acids and, doing all of these other things. Even in their tradition, they acknowledged that the lab work initially came first, and then the spiritual tradition got isolated because lab work's hard,
Yeah. I mean, that's very interesting. Well, the first thing I think would be appropriate to point out is that's actually Masonic tradition as well, right? They say our ancient brethren wrought in operative masonry, whereas we work in speculative. It's a very and what's really interesting is being somebody who works with their hands and things like that. I garden. I'm a carpenter professionally, and a musician. There are these moments where no matter what you're doing in terms of mundane life, you get this clarity, this presence of consciousness that comes oftentimes off the mat for me. Like it happens in life,
exactly.
This spontaneous revelation in the most literal sense of that word, revealing of place and time, and specifically of consciousness. And that gets lost in the mix. Consciousness is almost like a dog on a chain to your thoughts. Your thoughts and your consciousness are not, they're not the same thing. The observing capacity, the I am behind those things, when that's allowed to sort of just be, it's very magical and transformative, and can be very initiatic, I think.
Yeah.
And it's a really good point to bring that up, because I mean, I definitely didn't know that. I didn't know that there were breathing techniques that accompanied this, and yang and yin phases. It's becoming more and more attractive to me by the minute. So
Well, yeah. See, what in the Western alchemical lab practice theory, what they call yin in the Taoist tradition, we would call that celestial salt. And what we, what they would call yang, we would call that celestial niter. And these are basically like, we would call them causal archetypes. If we wanted to think about it in terms of geometries, we're talking about angles and segments, or zeros and ones. If we wanted to talk about it in terms of binary, again, zeros and ones, we're just, it's the very same basis that structures absolutely anything, positive, negative polarities, et cetera, in terms of the foundations of electromagnesis. So we're always, if something is good in one tradition, you will find it in another tradition, just described another way, just slightly. The concepts behind it, or the philosophy behind it, is always the same, but the flavor that they style the dish with, so to speak, is what ends up changing. So it's like, you've had chicken 1,000 different ways, the enlightenment is chicken, and it just gets served up differently and spiced in different dishes. So.
That's a great analogy. So going with what you're saying, this is a problem that I've had, right? Because even in initiatic traditions that focus on the spiritual stuff, you're left with a few alchemical terms. Well, more than a few alchemical terms, symbols, diagrams, tracts, treatises, personages, events, right? There's this whole alchemical history that we want to cleave to, and in this part of the tradition, but you don't really get much until you go and learn about it yourself. And one of another issue, again, is when I am studying alchemy and the alchemical tracts, the source material specifically, I feel like when Alice in Wonderland is in that really, really weird forest right before she meets the Cheshire Cat, there's no way for me to figure out which way to go. So how is it that you approach parsing these texts? Is that something that you do?
Yeah, definitely in my own alchemical practice, in my own alchemical experience, I started looking at those texts primarily as a result of the Amorc and Jean Dubuis coursework. They would, make quotes of something, and then I'd go in, I'd take a look at that text and take a look at the alchemical practices that they were actually performing. That is, for me, that has made those texts so much more contextually easy to guide yourself through. It's not as disorienting as being in the fever dream forest, so to speak, but you're able to instead kind of understand, like, okay, this guy is talking about a pyrolytic distillation, and so what material could he be talking about based on the descriptions that are here? But we know we're using fire and we're capturing a vapor. His material doesn't sound like a liquid, sounds like a solid. That automatically tells us pyrolytic distillation. And then we can say, like, okay, if he's seeing peacock iridescence in it, either there's something that happens with the material that he's working in, where in its liquid state, once it gets distilled, you're seeing that, or more likely he's working with copper or nickel. And then you can even try that in your laboratory, try and take, some material and pyrolytically prepare it, and so on and so forth, and then distill it and be like, did either of those produce that color? Oh, this one produced that color. Cool. He must be talking about copper. But just like the spiritual alchemists do, this is why it's actually so important. You can't just say, like, okay, that's copper and that's the chemical component. Otherwise, you're just practicing chemistry, a really base form of chemistry, in fact. The alchemist takes a look at that and says, okay, is this part of my body? Is this part of my soul? Is this part of my spirit? What is happening? What is the catalytic conversion, I guess, process that is happening here? And how can I like understand that to better my understanding of self, transformation or self-exaltation. So those texts, they are really illuminated by the lab work, and you have to have, especially with the old dudes, like, early, like late Dark Ages, very early Renaissance, are probably some of the most enigmatic. But during the Renaissance, they got very enigmatic as well. It wasn't until about the time of the scientific revolution where people were starting to speak in relatively straightforward terms. And even then, they didn't have chemical terminology for, another 50 to 150 years. So they would still have to refer to things as like, oh, a green lion. And you'd have to know that the green lion, objectively does not exist. It's a subjective thing. Two authors can be talking about a green lion, talking about two different works. They're not talking about the same substance or even the same processes or anything. So you really have to have a familiarity with the lab work to know what they would even be talking about by way of processes, and then narrow it down from there based on your experience with other things. And in the modern age, we get that luxury, and we also have the luxury of being able to talk about the substances that they were making in chemical terms now, so that we can get it even more precise. I've talked about this a number of times on various podcasts, that alchemy itself underwent the alchemical process from the time of Paracelsus onward. Paracelsus kind of created this new version of alchemy, which is spagyric medicine. Use alchemy to create medicines and to destroy disease. Don't necessarily use it just for the transformation of alchemical, of lead into gold or of baser metals into gold, or for other more base kind of purposes, but to be able to use it for something important. And then eventually, just a couple hundred years after he invented it, it got separated. Spiritual components went one way, especially with AIM work. The laboratory components devolved into chemistry, and the psychological components went towards Jungian psychology, Freudian Jungian psychology. And so the soul, the spirit, and the body of alchemy have been separated. And we're in a really cool time now that they've all been really well worked on and purified to a degree that where we put them all back together in the present moment, we have even a greater understanding of each of the individual components, and we can do things far greater than what the old dudes could, because we have a greater level of understanding. We're standing on their shoulders so we can see further.
That's an amazing analogy. I love that. Everything kind of separating out from there. It's, because without that kind of historical context and that depth or familiarity with the history of it, these things do kind of seem, it's like, where do all these things come from? What are they revolving around? Jungian psychology, as you're saying, these, I guess, I don't know what you want to call it, theosophical or new age kind of spiritualities that have penetrated and are undergoing, evolutionary processes themselves right now. And then, yeah, absolutely. Chemistry. You kind of think to yourself sometimes on the initiatic path, maybe, man, if we could all just get along, if everything could come together, that it would be the one thing, right? The only one thing. But how much familiarity with chemistry do you think, spiritual practitioners who want to become familiar with laboratory alchemy, how much do they have to know?
Well, let me put it like this. I've still never taken a chemistry class in my life. I know nothing about chemical equations. I've never stepped into a chemistry class. And I started, I'm not necessarily proud to say that either. I'm just proving a point. I probably do really well if I took some chemistry classes, but everything I've learned has been self-learned. And I started doing early spagyric work when I was 17, almost 18 years old. So realistically, you don't need to have much experience, don't need to be very old in order to really start practicing and to start reaping the benefits, especially the most practical benefits of making medicines for yourself, for consciousness as well as for health. You need not a lot. You need some herbs, which I suggest you find. not necessarily go out and buy them if you know you're so busy that you can't do you can't go out and find them, or it's a wrong season and you're really looking to get started or something like that. That's one thing, but it's always better to find them and let the herbs speak to you. You're going out looking for herbs, but then you might find one. Especially today, it's cool because you have, you know, phone apps. It's like, oh, what the hell is that? Oh, what the hell is that? And it'll tell you straight away. You don't have to like, you go to the library and check out plant identification books and, you know, toil to find out what it is. You can just find it out relatively easily. But then, you know, it's like, oh, all the shit grows in my yard. Like, what's this? Oh, that's plantain leaf. Oh, and plantain is good for, kidneys and skin and blah, blah, blah. I have all these skin breakouts. You'll find like 9 times out of 10, the quote unquote weeds that are growing in your yard are actually the medicinal allies that are saying, you could use us the most. You have these physical characteristics that show that you are lacking us. Take us. We have the planetary frequency that you need. And so, you know, if you have like a lot of, you know, wild carrot growing in your yard, or if you have a lot of dandelion, I mean, tons of people have dandelion. And I'll tell you, the people that have the most dandelions in their yard are usually the heaviest drinkers, or those who are taking drugs, opiates, etc. Because it's like, help us. We got the liver thing. We got it on lockdown. Like, you can't go wrong. Any part of us is going to work for the liver. Like, no matter what, just take it. And people don't. But that's the concept, is like, listen to nature, realizing that the world around you, you are just inside of a large flask that is centrifuging around a large heat source. And essentially, if you pay attention to that and realize like, oh, all of these things around me are also components of me. They're coming from within me. And I am also just like being created in the mind of another. I'm really just like a molecule in even a larger macrocosmic structure, and so on and so forth. You can begin to identify the things around you, and you find that you have all of your 7 planets, all of your 7 dailies that you need immediately, sometimes not even further than your own yard or 150 feet from your own house. So it's important to kind of look towards those things. And then you need some mason jars, stainless steel condiment containers, something to burn with, you know, just a little fire pit. I like to use a rocket stove, actually. It's much more efficient and it gets hotter temperature, and you don't put out as much exhaust either. And a couple of like small pieces of equipment. So like, people can start with no technical knowledge, no chemical knowledge, nothing. If you can burn some things, and if you can make tea slowly, then you can definitely start with spagyria. And it's cool because each different item that you make can draw you in a little deeper and say, you know, in order to undertake this work, which I feel I could do if I wanted to now, is I need to buy this little piece of equipment. How much does that cost? Oh, it's like $60 for me to get a small retort. Cool. I'll buy that. And then I can do some base distillations, make some more complicated items of pharmacopoeia, you know, to work on different structures. Or I can start to, you know, for a $600 investment or whatever, I can start to distill my own essential oils for my own work, and so on and so forth. And so that's kind of the way that I got into it, was tiptoeing into it, doing things for a long time until I felt that I could move to the next level, and then finally moving to the next level. And my first distillation kit was a teapot, duct tape, copper tubing, and an empty 2-liter bottle. That's what I used. So, you know, you don't have to know much about much, and you don't even need to have much of an enterprising MacGyver type ingenuity, because there's, you know, like Ask Jeeves and all of the other things that have existed since like 2004 or whatever, when I was a kid, that you ask, you know, simple stuff like, how do you distill something? And it'll show you, and then you'll get all sorts of pictures. I mean, you don't even have to be a MacGyver and put things together anymore. You just look online, and there'll be other people who have done what you wanted to do, and you can learn how to do it. And there's even multiple places to buy really cheap, affordable labware these days when you do want to expand. So yeah, most people, I would expect, have no chemical knowledge, and that should not bar somebody from getting into alchemy. The ancients didn't have much either.
Yeah. Well, that's very encouraging. Makes me take heart. I would never have guessed in a million years that you have no formal chemistry background. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's like anything else, right? The more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. And it seems like the people who have made an earnest start at it get, like you're saying, do get drawn in. I started I started herbalism a couple of years back. I've distilled essential oils and hydrosols and things like that. And of course, obviously tinctures and
Yeah.
teas. And in Chinese medicine, we do those 3-hour decoctions, right?
Yeah.
That slow tea. But the thing, like right now, it's getting close to planting season. So we're starting seeds and stuff like that. We have a grow room and a grow station here. And a couple of beds. One thing that I've kind of been curious about over the years, and I've actually gotten a few people to, they've just randomly asked me recently, in terms of astrology, right? Let's say you want to go by moon phase, that's really easy, or you want to do, you want to do day and hour formula for harvesting or for transplanting or something like that. The thing is that there's a lot of competing references and stuff like that. I mean, how do you deal with stuff like that? Do you deal with stuff like that? What kind of references do you use?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In fact, I initially started off with the references for the salt, sulfur, and mercury hours and charts from the International Alchemy Guild, which are all based in the Rosicrucian tradition that Amorc put out many, many years ago. So those are very common. You'll see those without much discrepancy within a lot of Western, especially like somebody from France in the Kabbalistic order of Rosicrucis and somebody in Amorc are going to have the exact same charts. Like it's pretty clear from Germany westward, that tradition within the Western esoteric mystery traditions these days. That's the way I learned. Eventually I grew into learning more about Paracelsus' work, and Paracelsus put down all of the astrologers of his day. He hated their form of astrology and told them that tropical astrology was entirely fake. And so that got me thinking like, oh, okay, well, if Paracelsus was saying that, but he was still saying that the cause of disease, one of the causes of disease in spagyric medicine is the cause of disease due to stars. He's not saying throw astronomy out. He's saying astrology is different. And even during his time, it was about half a sign off. During our time, it's definitely a sign off. And so I started doing split test clinical trials with clients to be able to see if I could use medical astrology of the Western Renaissance tradition to predict different styles of disease in various clinical trial people. So they would come to me and they would say, okay, look, I'm interested in being a research subject. I'm willing to pay this much in order to have custom spagyrics produced for me based on whatever you find in your astrology deal. And that's what funded the research. Now, what I did was when I took them on, I said, okay, first, in order for you to even be applicable towards this, I have to be able to cast a chart in a couple of different systems. And then I will tell you based on those natal charts, what your life's general predispositions, health predispositions are likely to be. Now, this is going to be within the course of an entire lifespan, but I'm going to be focusing on the things that are most likely to affect you right now based on your transits and stuff. And when we did that, I only had like a 62% to 65% accuracy using tropical astrology. And when I used sidereal astrology of the Vedic form, now that went up to about 80%. The highest I got was 83% with one of the clients. And so we decided to continue the process with that Vedic astrology because we didn't have many other choices at that point. We didn't know how to get more correct than 80 to about 85% with those predictions. And we found that the systems of correspondences that we would find in texts like Nicholas Culpeper's and of course, there's Dennis William Houck has his own version that he published through the International Alchemy Guild, which I was using at the time, of herbs and foods and materials that correspond to these planets, and then simultaneously preparing those under the planetary hours charts that we would find. And in all cases that we would harvest the medicines or grow the medicines under those planetary hour charts as well. And so we were doing the very best that we could with the data that we had, but throughout the course of that research, which was 13 months long, clinical research with, we have 58 different research subjects, about 43 of them finished all 13 months. So the data indicates that basically the planets and the planetary charts and the hours and things like that did not actually, like the substances we were making, or maybe the way that we were talking about the herb itself and its planetary ruler, it didn't seem to have much effect, or it didn't eliminate in all cases the cause of disease due to the stars that we were looking for based on that research trial. And so we knew that we had to hit the drawing board again. And eventually I saw Nassim Harameyn's video of, here's the sun, and it itself is catapulting through space. And we're not just going around the sun like this in the 2D model. We're kind of going like this. We're corkscrewing, and the sun is constantly moving forward, and we're, moving and like keeping along with it. And that got me thinking about different styles of charts and so on and so forth, until eventually I ran into Athan Chimenti's work of masteringthezodiac.com, and he practices what he created as true sidereal astrology. It means that it's the exact same as astronomy. If I look up into the sky and I see Jupiter or Venus, the constellation that is directly behind them is the constellation that Jupiter or Venus are in. Now, for years up until then, I had also been practicing biodynamic agriculture, which uses a pretty similar system. The main difference is that with Athan's system of true sidereal astrology, we take into account the little sliver of Ophiuchus that exists along the ecliptic as well. The other thing is that the constellations are not equal in size. Just 1 second here. Yeah, the constellations are not equal in size. So essentially, the biodynamic model that I was using was not true to astronomy, but it was close. And I found great success, absolutely amazing success in the planting cycles of Maria Thun and of biodynamics. And I had experienced virtually the same things that Maria Thun over a 30 or 40 year career had published and talked about, noticing as well that things that are leaf plants, like lettuce, for instance, if you plant them during a time where the constellation is in a water sign, then you will get the best results. So if you plant with, plant your lettuce when the moon is in Pisces, especially because it's an above ground harvest, you would ideally do that during a waxing cycle of the moon. So moon in Pisces, waxing cycle, best time to plant, transplant, sow, etc. Then you will be able to see really extraordinary progress inside of that plant. And you don't usually want to harvest lettuces under a moon sign, under a water sign. Just because they will go bad fast. So unless you're eating them that same day, in which case they have a greater sap content, they're better for you. But for storage, you should do them on an air day, harvest them. But aside from that, it's pretty cut and dry that harvesting, planting, transplanting, etc., under one of the signs that has an elemental correspondence that corresponds to either the root part, the leaf part, the flower part, or the fruit or seed part of the plant. And so I'd experienced good success with that. So when I found Athan's work, what I started doing was taking account of where the moon actually was in the sky, not as you can calculate it, but as it actually is, because his calculation is damn near exactly the same. The only difference between astronomical positions and his positions are that the constellation of Aries may begin here and Taurus doesn't begin here. And in the sky, that takes the moon, 30 minutes to move from the last star of Aries into the first star of Taurus, let's say. For astrology purposes, for everything except the moon, we have to draw a midpoint and say that that is the cusp. And so anything within a few degrees here and a few degrees here of that cusp are considered a blend of energies. That's the only difference that you're going to find between his style of astrology and astronomy. And so we started running more tests, plant tests at this point. And we did them in aquaponic environments. We did it with our beyond organic, like regenerative, no-till cannabis production. We did it with, I'm trying to think, we did like carrots and tomatoes and a couple of other things in soil tests as well. And we found that that completely took care of all of the discrepancies that I had had in the past with the biodynamic calendar. And so I started extracting herbs according to that as well, and found the very same thing. If I extract a plant like that, I'm harvesting its leaf, say like lemon balm, for instance, its leaf and its stem. If I do that, I get a greater yield of 2 to 5% almost always on the extraction. If I do that on a day that corresponds to a leaf, which is going to be a water sign when the moon is in a water sign. And so we transplanted a lot of those principles and were able to flesh them out and prove them. Because they differed, though, we ended up referring to those as alchemiculture processes and times and alchemiculture tables. What we started doing was saying, okay, what happens if I use things in a tropical system of astrology and calculate the ideal times, and then do it versus this new system that Athen had? And we were constantly showing that between tropical system, biodynamic system, and this new alchemiculture calendar, we had much greater success with the alchemiculture calendar and concepts. So that eventually led me to fleshing out a ton of different split test studies to see if we got greater vitality in our extractions, if we would grow the plant, ourselves at our research gardens here under this very certain effect, harvested under a certain effect, extracted under that same effect, and so on and so forth. If we could increase the vitality according to control subjects that were not made with any real time care or preparation at all, but from the same batch of materials. And that's why we had to be able to grow stuff here at our research gardens. And what we found was a system that we can reliably utilize, and that has been utilized now for 2 years all the way across the world. People in Europe are using the system and everything. And I've been publishing for the last 2 years the calendar and the entire count. It's known as the astronomological calendar. And that shows the position of all of the planets as they actually are in the sky, along with all of the different cycles of the moon, which is important for biodynamic gardening and those principles, which, like I said, most of biodynamic principles, everything that I could test that was true and effective made its way into alchemiculture. But alchemiculture also borrows from permaculture, agricultural practices and lots and alchemical lab practices too. So like we make medicines for the soil, just like we make medicines for people. And we administer it to the soil through watering and compost teas and, other ferments and stuff like that. In the same way that we administer spagyrics to us through water directly under the tongue and through adding it to wines and stuff like that. So it's basically the exact same concept. So that's what we've grown into with our astrological work. And we use our own system because we have found that it works exceptionally well in the face of all of the research and the scrutiny that I have put into it over a period. I mean, we started those clinical trials in 2014, but I was already studying for like 2 or 3 years in the lab, trying to find out like what works best, and then doing, tropical system astrology planting versus biodynamic planting, and just seeing like, oh, the squash that we planted with biodynamic seeds at the time of the biodynamic calendar had a much greater vitality and vigor than plants that were planted according to the tropical system. So I had already seen some of that. We just had to flesh it out through a whole series of different clinical trials. And ultimately, the system of astrology that we use now is also the same system that I use to calculate the times of people's births and so on and so forth, and the positions of the planets, in order to be able to eliminate ens astrale for them too, or cause of disease due to the position of the planets. or technically it means cause of disease due to the stars, but it's the positions of the planets. It's all a geometric relationship to where the planets are in their transits versus where they were at the time of your birth. Typically, trines are a good thing. Conjunctions are a good thing. Oppositions, squares are bad, and sextiles can go either way. With sextiles, you typically get out of something. It's a good result in the long run, like a good learning experience, but it came with so many trials. It was like, well, that's not what I wanted, but I got something that was still valuable.
That's excellent, man. That's all very valuable. I'm sure information that you've probably done a lot of us quite a service by investing so much time. And I'm gonna have to get my hands on that calendar for sure. Very interesting stuff. I typically have 2 stock questions that I ask everybody when we approach the end of our discussion. I was going to ask you if you have a ritual component to any of your personal practices. It sounds like you've engaged in some level of that by the conscious awareness that you bring to any of that stuff. But maybe you could elaborate a little on that in I guess in relation to this question. If you are, well, I'll just leave it at this. How do you experience magic?
Yeah. How do I do it now is different than how I did it younger, when I was trained to experience magic through the alchemical practices in the Western esoteric tradition with Kabbalah and Kabbalistic works. And so that'd be very familiar to most of the Masons and Rosicrucians and folks of the Golden Dawn and so on and so forth, where there's a ritual Western, very clearly Western, essentially Egyptian derived type of magical practice, ceremonial magical practice. And for many, many years, that was kind of the thing that I would use because that's what I was taught this tradition with. As I gained familiarity with it and was able to allow my own soul and my own volition to speak, and it's just like learning music, right? You have to stick by the laws of music until you know how to break the laws of music in a way that still sound good. It's like that same thing. And so at the point where I could break free and start to do things that were a little less, how can you call it, like sanctioned by various organizations.
Right.
I started getting into Druidry. And of course, Druidry, modern Druidry, has the same exact roots as modern day Freemasonry and modern day Rosicrucianism, is that they were largely built upon during that 19th century occult revival. And I got into the works of John Michael Greer. I got the opportunity to meet him in Las Vegas, actually, at the International Alchemy Guild conference one time. And we were able to work together a little bit during that conference to talk about a couple of key ideas. And, he's primarily from the Welsh tradition and enjoys that 19th century occult revival vibe. I was starting to kind of grow away from that during that time, just because there's a certain level of it that is highly syncretic and highly theosophical too, especially the more that you get into the 21st century. Theosophical type thinking and syncretic thinking started to like create new things, and for me it just wasn't my flavor anymore, and so I started to move on. My practices now are more of a Druid tradition of Ireland, and they're very, very personal, although I do belong to Ireland's Celtic Druid Temple, which is run by Con and Neve. And then I also belong to Do More Druid Order, which is an order here in the United States based out of Colorado Springs. And in both of those, we learn how to speak Irish and how to use Irish law, known as Brehon law, and how to be able to recite massive verses of poetry and to remember genealogies and lots of other things, along with various ritual practices. And I create a lot of my own works, especially because I branched out many, many years ago into folk magic, especially Appalachian-based folk magic and various forms of hedge magic. And, I've just always been interested in magic, I guess, all my life. So I've taken in a lot of different things and in my own way have found what works and what sticks and what I feel appeases my sensibilities and have just kind of stuck with that. But it's kind of eclectic in a way, and it's my own personal practice, even though it's largely inspired by historical traditions of Irish Druidry in particular. But yeah, I experience magic on the daily. In fact, people will often say, like, well, why do you believe in magic? It's like, I don't just believe in magic, I depend upon it. Like, that has got me everywhere. Every little advancement in my life has been because of the hard work and the mental focus that I put in to being able to get to that next level and that next phase. And if you understand that life ultimately is a ritual, which is what I think magic is the training for, then you understand that if you limit the variable factors down and down and down and down and down by finding out. And, for me, I have always approached magic like I approach my lab work. It's an experiment to see which method works best. And then I refine it and use that method. It's like, okay, now even within that, what are the variables and how can I keep reducing it? And that has leaked over into all areas of my life, to where I would say that my life essentially is a ritual. From waking to sleeping, I'm constantly doing things that help me to attain the results that I want to be able to attain. And I use the same forces that I would use in ritual in my waking life to be able to attract those things to me. So
very well put, man. That is I think a beautiful perspective. And it's one that ultimately I think is hard won. You have to have put a lot of serious time into this particular work in order to derive that kind of the way that I put it to students is that it's similarly to what you were saying, because especially nowadays, everybody wants to be an expert, but nobody wants to do any of the actual work because of things like Wikipedia and stuff like that. And don't get me wrong, some people are gifted, but yeah, at first you have to practice magic like music. You have to learn the scales. You have to learn the modes and the notes and all that stuff. And because it's something you do, but eventually, like music, it will be something that you are. You just, you'll be able to improvise in the same way, moment to moment to moment, and to be able to, I've never heard it even put the way that you put it, to view life as a ritual. I think that that's incredibly beautiful. It touches on all sorts of things having to do with both order and spontaneity in our universe, free will and determinism, and just riding the opportune kairos, the time and the moment. So that's a brilliant thing to say, at least in my humble opinion.
Very cool.
Yeah, the last question that I ask everybody is, so everything that we've spoken about this evening, we've covered quite a bit of ground. There's a lot to chew on. For anybody listening to this episode, what 3 books, podcasts, seminars, what have you, in any media, give the listeners, if you please, 3 recommendations for, I guess, extracurricular learning on alchemy or anything we've touched on this evening.
Cool. Yeah. For those that want to dive more into an integrated approach to alchemy, meaning that like psychological, spiritual, and laboratory being all kind of one, ironically, the very best book out there is called The Complete Idiot's Guide to Alchemy. And I love that book. Dennis Hauck wrote it. It's not like, I wouldn't say it's a complete view of all lab alchemy practices, but it doesn't pretend to be that either. It kind of shows a wide perspective of modern laboratory practices and where the psychological and spiritual work fit inside of those lab processes, so that whatever type of alchemy you begin to practice, you can do it with a greater knowledge, understanding of all of the other components that kind of go along with it. So that's a really great foot in the door. For those who want to take their lab alchemy practice just a little bit deeper and learn how to integrate those types of things, either of the books by Robert Allen Bartlett are great. He has The Way of the Crucible, and he also has a book called Real Alchemy. Both of those are absolutely fantastic. Before him, There was, well, I guess there was one by Brian Cote-Noir, which is really abbreviated. It's great once you practice, because then you're like, oh yeah, in plain language, he described it. But when you're just starting out, it's too plain of language and it's not detailed enough. So Robert really makes his work detailed enough to help get you through the work and to understand what's going on. And then the other thing that I can never suggest too highly is to get the works of Jean Dubuis. Reach out to me if you can't get them. support@phoenixaurelius.org. And I can set them up in a Google Drive with the public share folder if you guys, if we get enough interest. But you should be able to find PDFs of those pretty quickly. And there is actually a physical copy that is available. I've got it on my shelf over here of Spagyrics, the entire coursework, which initially was like volumes 1 and 2, published by Triad Publishing. Those are kind of rare to find physical copies of the Triad Publishing, but the new version is even better, in my opinion, because it includes a lot of coursework that was only published in French, and it has all of the English coursework, which was translated by Patrice Melezet, as well as new translations of the French work, which make it even more complete than the ones put out by Triad Publishing, in my own experience. And the basis of esoteric knowledge, or I think it's called the Foundations of Esoteric Knowledge by Jean Dubuis, is kind of the Western esoteric primer, that even if you've been a part of Western esoteric organizations or fraternities, etc., for a long time, it would be a good idea to read that in particular, to give you the idea of what flavor of esoteric terminology and practice, which is very Kabbalah heavy, that Jean Dubuis will constantly refer to in the rest of his alchemical works. And he goes all the way through making the red stone through the Flamel pathway. So you start with herbs and move your way on up through successively more difficult laboratory processes, as well as going through and they're very nonlinear too, which is an interesting thing. It's nonlinear. It's like based on the teachings that he has, to get you to a point of really solid familiarity with alchemical corpus. I would just advise listeners not to think that, not to mistake those works for what Jean Dubuis wrote about them for. He wanted to be able to say, okay, we've published this. Now, once you're done, you're done. You're a really good alchemist. You're not a master alchemist ever. I wouldn't consider myself a master alchemist. I wouldn't consider Robert Bartlett doesn't consider himself a master alchemist. Other people might look at us and say things like that. We don't say that about ourselves, though, because no matter how much those books have shown you, they're still just scraping the surface of all that there is. They're just showing you the rules, and the rules end there. Now it's time for you to go out and explore, make new rules, bend the rules, find what happens in different situations, mix items of pharmacopoeia, and figure out new things, So, yeah, those three would kind of be the next platforms. And for folks who are interested in staying in a vein of more modern research, because I take my stuff very heavily out of the esoteric tradition, because I can't show that it's perennially true or objectively effective outside of the systems of initiation that it's meant for. In terms of practical medicine making, I do have a podcast. We are coming back with the new season. It's called the Alchemiculture podcast. And in fact, Sky from Philosophical Minds actually made our logo for us. So like 2 years ago now. So I do talk about lots of topics like this. And there's a couple of episodes from our first season too that people can dive into if they're interested in learning a little more.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, Phoenix. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope we speak again real soon.
Ike, yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And yeah, anytime, man. And you want to have a conversation, let's do it.